All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and we are thrilled to be able to help facilitate and host our SHS webinar series. Thank you so much for being here today. Just very brief housekeeping pieces here. We are recording the webinar, and we will place this in our CTL resource webinar page for future reference. And without further ado from that, I am going to pass this over to one of our very own NCU alum, Veronica Shake.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. My name is Veronica Shake. As Emily said, I'm a recent alum of NCU's MSN program. So I graduated earlier this year, and I am part of the Interdisciplinary Professional Education Advisory Committee. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Eva Karp. As the Senior Vice President and Chief Clinical and Patient Safety Officer for Cerner, one of the largest suppliers of health information technology services, devices, and hardware worldwide, Dr. Eva Karp has executive responsibilities for defining Cerner's clinical practices to optimize user experience, patient outcomes, and organizational execution. She has responsibilities for the clinical and provider voice related to clinical strategies, regulatory affairs, medical affairs, patient safety, and data management. Dr. Karp partners closely with the regulatory and legislative affairs teams and is responsible for the clinical, operational, and strategic leadership necessary to drive high-value clinical practices and functions as the clinical leader for all organizations across the globe. In this role, Dr. Karp also co-chairs Cerner's Clinical Executive Governance Board, ensuring the voice of the clinician is part of all product development and support initiatives. She engages client organizations to understand their needs and optimize clinical workflows in order to achieve increased patient safety, and partners with partners to help organizations navigate changes in the healthcare landscape while integrating Cerner's strategies to help achieve organizational satisfaction. In addition to her 20 years at Cerner, she has developed 3 patents relating to clinical workflow and intervention. She has over 16 years of experience in healthcare informatics, 12 years of neurological and surgical ICU care experience, holds a doctorate in healthcare administration, a master's degree in business administration, a bachelor's degree in business administration, and an associate's degree in nursing. She's a fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives and has served and continues to serve in many leadership positions for a variety of organizations and associations. So tonight's presentation is entitled Health IT and Patient Safety is Everyone's Role. As we can see, Dr. Karp is well qualified to talk about this topic. So I now turn the time over to her. As a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Karp with this presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So Dr. Karp.
Thank you, Veronica. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to talk to you. This is about one of my favorite topics, and it is critical to understand that health IT does not stand alone. It's not the CIO's job. It's all of our job. And if we don't work collectively together, bad things happen. So I'm going to start with a story and take you back in time. Some of you that don't travel may not be as aware of the Boeing 727 MAX 8 and when it came out many years ago. But I want to show a video that tells a story about the introduction of the Boeing 727 MAX 8 and how things went terribly wrong. Emily, if you could run the video, please.
It was en route from Addis Ababa to Nairobi, Kenya. This airplane started encountering some technical problems.
The 737 MAX 8 has been the biggest seller to date for Boeing for its airline division ever.
The engines are actually a little larger, they're more efficient.
that changed the center of gravity of the airplane.
And that's what led them to come up with this piece of software designed to counteract that tendency.
To basically prevent something like that from happening.
The question is, did that attempt to make it safer actually, in the end, make it riskier to fly for the flight crew?
Fight for control to maintain stability of the airplane.
And in this case, potentially, the computers won.
We know that the sensors began sending erroneous information to the flight management system.
And the computer system made a decision with bad information, basically. It's important that we get as many facts as we can and as much data as we can before we make sweeping decisions.
Here's the problem, though. If you have an airplane that violently pitches over, even if you've trained yourself in how to turn off that system quickly, you have precious little time to do anything. You could make an argument that the system is fundamentally unsafe.
So what went wrong with the Boeing 737 was they had did a redesign of the plane, putting the engines further up to the front of the plane. And because of the weight of that, it was pulling the plane down. So because engineers are engineers, we'll just write a little bit of software and we will pull it back up or push it back down, depending on which way the sensors are telling it to do it. The problem was the pilots didn't know about the software. And then they started flying this plane and the plane was pulling down. When the pilots were pulling up, the plane was ignoring the pilot and the computer, the software won. And the plane crashed. And then it crashed a second plane before they withdrew the plane from actively flying until they correct it. They thought they were going to pull it offline for a couple of weeks. It was offline for a couple of years before they were able to correct that. So the software doesn't always work, and the human needs to be able to know how to re-engage if the software is not working appropriately. So in America, we have preventable errors, and they lead to prompt patient harm. As you can see, 50 deaths occur every hour. We have 1,200 deaths every day, 8,400 deaths every week, and 34,000 deaths every month. And this is all related to different aspects. I would say patient safety is never related to one thing that went wrong. It's usually multiple factors that went wrong. And we have to look at it holistically. You can't just look at a hardware or software redesign without looking at the entire process from beginning to end to ensure that you're designing for the right workflow, the right process, and the right content as you go. That did not happen with the 737 MAX 8, but the amount of issues that are happening in healthcare today with patient safety issues, we are putting as many as 5 Boeing 737 crashes every day if we don't get a handle on the amount of patient safety issues that are happening in healthcare today. They're not all technology related. They could be systems, they could be systematic issues across the organization. It could be cultural issues. It could be any number of things, but we have to work together as shared responsibility to solve for anything that could result in a patient safety issue. Patient safety and EHRs get a very positive popularity contest in the any industry, we probably get our share of hits. So we get a lot of negative press in all of the publications that are coming out that patient safety errors are common with EHR use. These same patient safety problems occur with paper, but we've forgotten what paper was like, and the EHR sometimes gets facilitated as a root cause without really evaluating everything that contributed to a patient safety event. But with that said, patient safety issues are a concern in EHRs. They're unintended consequences of an EHR that really need to be evaluated because you've changed workflow and processes to clinicians that now involve technology. Just as the plane had software that changed how the plane worked, EHRs change how clinicians work as well. The issues that can compromise patient safety are vast. It could be any number of things, but EHRs do not operate alone. We've developed health integration to devices like an infusion pump that if a provider orders a medication, it automatically can be sent to that infusion pump and infused at the rate that the order prescribed. If that integration to that device doesn't work appropriately, it could also end up with a risk of patient safety. So you have to test across different environments and different technologies, not just what happens in the EHR itself. EHR downtimes. I've been in health IT over 30 years. And when I started in health IT, we had the nurse's brain where we wrote everything down on paper. And that way, that was what I knew I was going to do. And we had a paper EMR where we documented what medications we gave. So the medication record was its own source. But when you put it into an EHR and you get rid of all the paper, those processes have changed. So if a downtime comes and you have nurses that are practicing today that never practiced when I practiced a long time ago, they may not know how to do a downtime with paper. They don't know how to do that paper process at all because they've always operated in an electronic record. I remember when I started implementing EHRs some 30 years ago, nurses said that it would be pigs would fly before they got rid of their EMR and their meds. Well, pigs were flying all over the place, but when that EMR went down, they did not know how to operate without paper because they never had to do that process. So those downtime procedures and understanding downtime procedures are pretty important. Although we envision a world where the software will never fail. Emily will tell you she had an update to software right before this call. Things happen and they're not always planned. So you might have also heard death by 1,000 clicks where EHRs are going wrong. Is that data in the EHR that clinicians feel like they spend all their time in an EHR and all they do is document in the EHR and it really doesn't support their clinical reasoning or their clinical decision making? Well, those EHRs are not the root cause. It's what you put in the documentation, which is designed many times by the organization that we're over designing content in the EHR that is not relevant to why the patient's presenting or what the clinician needs to know to make the right decisions for their care. So it's very important to make adjustments of not using an EHR as a lever or a forcing function to get someone to document something because you might want to know it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or at 2 a.m., 20 years from now. It's information you need to take care of the patients today. But these are all factors of lack of governance and lack of involvement of clinicians that actually practice on helping design the technology and what needs to happen. Now, I gave you a story that occurred from outside the healthcare industry, but we do have stories that happen in the healthcare industry that are just as catastrophic. So I'm going to tell you about a story, and you may or may not have heard about it, but there was a patient, her name was Charlene. She was admitted to a neuro ICU with a headache and vision loss in the left field of her eye. She went down for an MRI, and they found a hematoma on the brain. But the physician thought that it really could resolve on its own, but just in case, he ordered a PET scan a diagnostic PET scan before she went home. Charlene was 74 years old, I believe, but was a little bit afraid of the scanner and told her nurse that I'm a little bit claustrophobic. Could you make sure that they give me a medication to help relax me if I'm going to go down to that PET scan so I don't get so nervous? So the physician did place an order for Versed, 2 milligrams, to be given IV push, which was verified by a pharmacist. The radiology nurse that was receiving the patient down in radiology said, I'm not comfortable giving Versed, and I don't know how to observe a patient that's had Versed. Could you come down and have the primary nurse come down with the patient where they can observe the patient? Well, the primary nurse was actually observing another patient, so they asked a floating nurse to go down to radiology to administer the Versed. But that floating nurse was also precepting another new nurse and was on the way down to ED to do a swallow test for a patient that had presented in the ED. So she was going to do this on the way to the ED, stop and give Charlene her Versed and head on down to the ED to do the swallow test. That's when it all went wrong. I want to share another video with you, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to have Emily play the next video.
Ethan called and said that his patient, CM, was in radiology to have a scan and that she needed a medication for anxiety. I went to the AccuDose machine to look for the medication that he said had been ordered for her, and I couldn't find it under her listed medications. So I called him back. I was pulling this medication. I didn't think to double check what I thought I had pulled from the machine. I used the override function. I don't recall ever seeing any warnings that showed up on the monitor. If there was a warning on the drawer, it didn't strike me. There are a lot of drawers with warnings. It's a critical care area. I walked across the hall to the tube station, and at that point, Ethan approached me, and he was holding the bag of contents that I had given him earlier. He asked if this was the medication that I had given Miss Murphy, and I looked at the bag, or I'm sorry, CM. I looked at the bag and I confirmed that it was, and that's when he said it's not Versed, it's Vecuronium. So I asked him to give the bag to our charge nurse.
Now, going back to the medication pool, we heard the pharmacist say earlier that there was some warnings, and Mr. Stryans entered the exhibit with the vial. Do you recall seeing the warning paralytic around the top of the vial?
If it was there, I did not acknowledge it. Desensitizing, alarm fatigue, and you get used to certain processes. I'm pretty sure it's a big factor in how a lot of mistakes happen. You get used to a certain thing. You trust what the computer says. You ignore that alarm because you've heard it 10,000 times and it's been, false or inappropriate. I won't ever be the same person.
So Radonna, any of you that watch what has happened with this case are probably just as devastated as any nurse that worries, because we all know we have all made med errors. This is a catastrophic med error. Vecuronium is a paralytic. It provided paralysis, so Charlene couldn't breathe. And because Redonda went down to the ED, no one was observing her and didn't notice that she wasn't breathing. And 20 minutes later, a tech came up and noticed that she was not breathing, and they resuscitated her and got her back up to the neuro ICU. Redonda, as she said, came up to the unit, and as she had pulled the drug, she had put everything in a package and had handed it to the primary nurse. And that's when he noticed that it was becuronium. When we design processes and work, what was not stated is that they had a brand new EMR, and it was not working correctly to the med administration, the med dispensing system. So all the nurses were using override because the systems were not communicating. When she went to pull the med from the the dispensing system, the order was not there. She couldn't see it. She called the nurse. The nurse said, I put the order in. She went ahead and typed in VE, did a search, and pulled out the first drug that came up, which was becuronium, which is not Versed. There are many aspects of failure in this particular case. Redonda was a second victim. If you ever hear of just culture, she did not experience a just culture. She admitted she made an error immediately. She was sent home and fired within 3 days. But this case didn't even come out until a year later, when there was a whistleblower that notified the state to come in and investigate it. And that's when we found out more about what happened. So what went wrong was it was people, process, and technology. Yes, Redonda did not do 5 rights, but Redonda was going down to the radiology department. She could have done 5 rights on paper like she did before when they didn't have electronic barcode med administration. Remember when I said if it was on the EHR, they knew how to do it, but when the system went down, they didn't know how to use paper. She forgot to do her 5 rights, which, yes, she lost her license and she cannot practice anymore, no longer has a job, but there was no 5 rights. There was no medication cart down in radiology for her to use automated barcode med administration. It just did not exist in radiology at that time. So I'm going to go through the people, process, and technology and issues that occurred just off the top of my head. There are many more. The people issue, staffing in radiology was not able to handle a sedation patient. Versed is not a very heavy drug, and a nurse in the radiology should have been able to handle it. She was a float nurse versus the patient's nurse, so she didn't see the order in the system. If it had been the patient's nurse, they may have been more aware and being able to pull the drugs and getting it into the administration system more quickly. The float nurse was being shadowed. So instead of where you are protected while you're giving medications and don't get any interruptions, she was teaching the float nurse how to do a swallow test. So she was talking to that float nurse about the swallow test that they were heading down to do in the ED and why they were doing it. So she was not focused on the medication. She was focused on the patient that she was seeing after that. She blew past many warnings. Versed is very different. It's administrated IV push, where the becuronium had to be mixed up with water and then been given. She should have seen a difference there, but she's never given becuronium, but she did think it was odd that the Versed had to be mixed up. She was multitasking. So when we have stacking, where we have so many things we're doing, we don't always think clearly and we miss things. The process, there was no clear protocol for radiology for sedation of a patient. Drug packaging for becuronium was not current or following ISMP standards, because it would have been with a resuscitation packet if it had been packaged the way that the ISMP recommended at that time. It is now, but it was not at that time. The nurse didn't identify the med that was being diluted, but she also didn't know policies and procedures related to conscious sedation in the radiology because they weren't documented, they weren't defined. The technology, the new HR was not integrated effectively to the drug delivery system, so it was creating workarounds that were unsafe. one would question why you have becuronium in a dispensing machine at all, because it should be under certain circumstances that you're giving that. And the automated drug system design should not have allowed anyone to pull a drug off of a search of 2 letters. And it was searching brand versus generic. It should have never searched, it should have been all brand or all generic, but it shouldn't have searched VE for brand and generic, or she would have not gotten becuronium even on the list, because it would have been a generic name of Norcuron, which I probably said that wrong. Legally, the medication was not recorded in the EHR because she thought she gave Versed, so she documented Versed. The charge nurse told her not to document the becuronium. That was one of the things that she was charged for and convicted for malicious negligence. Death reported as a result of a medical condition to 2 different physicians. So it was never reported that she died from a med error. It was reported she died from her medical condition that she presented with. And the whistleblower was what brought it all out in the end. So there were people, process, and technology all over the place that prevented things from going well. So there were, as I said, patient safety is usually multiple root causes, not just one, and you have to systemically resolve them all. I will say that since this event occurred, they have corrected all of the issues that had occurred, so they won't happen again. So what I'm going to talk about is the Swiss cheese model of looking at reducing patient harm. And in Swiss cheese model, they look at all the areas that the Swiss cheese provides holes for an issue to occur. So funding and resources. They didn't have the right devices in radiology. So if they had resource radiology to have a med administration cart down there, she could have had 5 rights down there. Resources, she was floating and doing multiple things and stacking on top of everything else that she was doing. So that introduced more potential risk or harm. Organizationally, it really wasn't looked at for root cause holistically. And even the chief medical officer said that we probably looked at this too narrowly and probably should have looked more deeply at all of the possible issues that could have occurred. The technical aspects of the EHR communicating effectively with the med administration system, the team, and having the right team and the right people at the right time to provide the care needed. And then the other issue was the tools that she had available to her at that time. If you take Swiss cheese and turn it into cheddar cheese, that means all of those holes do not exist, and we're able to navigate and put different mechanisms in place to mitigate harm. So if we evaluated a process from the time something is ordered to the time it's administered, we could have looked at all the handoffs between nursing and the pharmacy. We could have looked at whether the technology was communicating adequately with the machines. So if I am going to have a or dispensing system, the order system needs to work effectively with that med administration system or dispensing system, and it has to work effectively with your barcode meds administration. If all those pieces aren't in place, we've introduced holes in the Swiss cheese that need to be closed. So if you're looking at it from a governance perspective of how clinicians work together, meds are not just a nurse's role. It is a provider that's prescribing. It is the nurse that's going to administer after a pharmacist dispenses it. And if all of those handoffs are not adequate or secured, harm can occur. In this particular case, the Pyxis machine, AccuDose, was not working effectively, so override was being used. The medications that were placed in the AccuScan were not packaged appropriately for elevating the risk, although I will say on the vial, it did say this is a critical drug and requires ventilation. All the warnings were there. She was just distracted by talking about a swallow test. I mean, I don't want to say just, it was a massive error. and harm should have come. But she was criminally prosecuted and found guilty, and is now on, because she had a very gracious judge, she's on probation for 3 years. And if she successfully completes the probation, it will be a sponge from her record. She will never be a nurse again. She will never be able to practice again, but she won't have it on her record that she had criminal negligence on her record. So we're looking at the principles of high reliability thinking. And if we really look at all aspects of health IT from a high reliability perspective, we would look at things that may have filled in that Swiss cheese, such as preoccupation with failure. In healthcare, we tend to be reactive, not proactive. We look for the things that happen and how we're going to prevent them from happening again, as opposed to assume it's going to fail. What are all the aspects that could fail? And what are we doing to mitigate each of those aspects to ensure it doesn't fail? So look for things that could go wrong. Don't assume things are working until they go wrong. Assume they're going to go wrong, and then we'll fix them before they go wrong. Reluctance to simplify. Because work is so complex in healthcare and we're constantly worried about the complexity of healthcare, we tend to create shortcuts. And I will say nursing is probably the notorious designers of shortcuts. We will find a way to make something happen so we can do what we need to do to help that patient when we need to do it, even though that shortcut may not be the best possible process to do that. Quicker and easier is not necessarily safer. And sometimes we think if it's quicker and easier, I'm going to get that med to that patient faster, but that does not mean that was the right way or the best way and the safest way to do that. Sensitivity to operations is another high reliability thinking factor. We need to understand how the work is done and who does the work. So we design for the person that does the work, not design for the engineer, not designed for the CIO, not designed for whoever configures the software. Designed for the clinicians that actually practice and do the work. The other is the resilience, commitment to resilience, that we can constantly look and ensure that everything's fully functional and capable, and that we don't move away from the unintended consequences of getting comfortable or relaxed in what we're doing. And the most critical one to me, I work with a bunch of engineers on a routine basis. I work with a lot of product managers. I certainly don't tell an engineer how to code because that would not be good. It wouldn't go well. I don't tell the product managers how to do their product management design, but I do have a deference for expertise. So if I'm designing something for a critical care nurse, I'd like critical care nurses engaged. If I'm designing something for an anesthesiologist, I'd like for them to be engaged because they understand their work, they understand how things process, and they can provide insight to things that we may not think of. If an engineer thinks we describe what we want, but we may not always fully communicate what we mean and how we mean it to occur. So communication is hard. Anytime we describe something, you've got to ensure that what you described is what they heard. So it takes feedback and back and forth to ensure that what we communicated and what we asked for is actually what they understood, what they coded, and then that we test it for use for the appropriate use case by a particular role in a particular environment, and then it connects with all of the software. So one of the areas that I talk about, because what I find in a lot of organizations is that IT is perceived as the CIO's problem and IT's problem. And it's really, it should be clinically led. It should be clinically driven. It should be driven, if I'm revenue cycle, by the revenue cycle users. So we need to ensure that the process of decision-making involves the stakeholders that are most aligned to that process and that role, because if they're not at the table, we're going to miss something and it will be shortchanged by that process, and we'll miss the expectation of the clinician or the finance person, and then negative things will happen. When we look at governance, it's important to look at it from the avenue of how clinicians think. And that means I have to work cross-organizational with roles to design the workflow from the beginning to end. So if I'm designing a meds process, we need to bring the pharmacists to the table, physicians to the table, nurses to the table, and we need to look at it all from the technology, the process, and any communication and coordination that needs to occur by all stakeholders to ensure we support clinical practice and business operations. Formal communication of any process changes need to be communicated, and we need to work and support each of the roles' workflows and make sure the handoffs occur effectively. So part of the governance areas of opportunity and the most common challenges are alignment with organization goals and the vision of what we're trying to accomplish. Why are we doing meds process in an automated fashion? And are we achieving that in a safe way? Alignment across the organization. Is pharmacy on board, physicians on board, nurses on board? And do we have coordinated decision-making on how that process is going to work? And then we need to make sure the appropriate tools and processes are in place to ensure we have a safe process. Clinical decision-making and with the use of technology really requires deep education and understanding by the clinical providers that are going to use the technology. Many times we shortchange the education and training of clinicians. We might have some physicians that don't want to do training. That does not serve anybody well if the clinicians don't understand the software and how it communicates with other members of the care team. We must standardize care and standardize clinical processes for each role in the venue they practice and ensure that the handoffs occur effectively. And we need to make sure it supports the practice, that we're not designing practice around the technology, we're designing the software to support practice and how clinicians work. And if it's led by IT, it almost always fails. People and process must come before the technology. One of the areas of opportunity is organizational change management, and clinicians are not always thrilled with change, but if you approach it with a organized fashion of looking at change management, historically I've called it stop, start, continue. What are we going to stop doing? What are we going to start doing? And what are we going to continue doing? And how does that work holistically? And did we test it with clinicians at the front line to ensure those processes work? If something's not working correctly, we need appropriate governance to elevate concerns or where we feel something's not safe or needs further evaluation or executive input, where it can go up from the work groups to decision councils and then all the way to the executive steering committee if needed. But it must be clinically led and business enabled and IT supported. I have put in the deck examples of how we do decision-making criteria, where the work groups and ad hoc groups make decisions, what level of decisions they can make, what decisions can be made by the integrated council that works across all stakeholders in a particular workflow or process, and then executive leadership. If you need sponsorship for investment, more IT or more technology, whether you need other stakeholders brought to the table to handle things such as financial decisions, or prioritizing the work if you have multiple priorities, helping prioritize which one will give the biggest bang across the organization at the executive level. Guiding principles and charters are a must. If you don't have a charter of what you're trying to accomplish, no one knows what the goals are. And the guiding principles of how you're going to work together are also very important, and it needs to be clearly understood by all. I have also incorporated an example of a charter when you get the deck, and it includes the purpose, who the chairs are, who the membership should be, who the contributing members for the council should be, how frequently they should work, and what their responsibilities are. And it's just a template to give you an idea of what should be involved in a decision council. And that is the key moments of what I really wanted to share. And I really do apologize. I do not know why I can't keep sharing. Are there any questions?
Well, first off, thank you, Dr. Karp. We super appreciate you presenting for us and going through your presentation, slides notwithstanding. So it's been very helpful for you to go through this. One of the questions that is in the chat is, do you have any examples of executive leadership and practice that have been most successful and engaging, or that have been most successful in engaging clinicians in sufficient training? So what are skills or traits that leaders can use to have success in engaging those clinicians?
The engagement works well when you have clinical leaders at the table. So the CNO, the CMO, as well as the CNIO and the CMIO. If you have physician and nursing leaders that understand the technology, tightly aligned to the clinical leaders that own the clinical operations, the CMO for the physicians, the CNO for the nurses, and then the pharmacy leader. I have seen shared governance where all of those parties are at the table and not one role has power over the others. It's a collective shared responsibility to getting to the right answer. Education has to be a priority by those leaders. I will say nursing are very strong advocates of following their CNO and their clinical leadership. Physicians may not be as willing to do that, but in over 30 years in this industry, where I've seen failure is where physicians were given permission not to do education or training, and then things didn't go well. And the physicians are unhappy, the patients are unhappy, the clinicians that work with the physicians are unhappy. I would highly recommend strong training and governance should drive the requirement, not the IT shop. CIO cannot say physicians must train. The clinical and executive leadership need to say physicians will train, nurses will train, pharmacists will train.
I love that making sure that everybody is on the same page to have that standard and that bar set high, not being willing to bring it down, because like you said, that's how everybody stays safe and satisfied. Right. I think that's great. The next question is let's see. What barriers or constraints are there any technological barriers or constraints in addressing these experiences and in addressing these, the people side of support? Do you have, my words aren't working right now. Your technology isn't working. My words aren't working. So with working with people, we have the clinical or the person side of things. We also have the technology side of things. What barriers or constraints does the technology put into this collaboration?
The technology becomes a challenge if it's not stable and available. If the technology is not available or slow, clinicians won't use it. And this is where we get in the cultural dynamics with an engineer on what is slow. An engineer will say, well, the system's not down because it's moving. I don't care if it's moving, if it's slow, the clinician can't do what they need to do at the time they need. So it really is engaging the technology team and understanding the experience from a clinical perspective. Where I have found the biggest benefit is rounding with your technology team, your IT team, with clinicians that are actually using the software and getting feedback directly from those clinicians real time, with the engineer standing there or your IT team standing there. So they're not hearing it from you, they're hearing it directly from clinicians. it is eye-opening when an engineer sees what's happening or an IT person sees what's happening in practice, because they perceive their family member or them could be in that bed at some point, and they're going to want that technology to work well. So I say the technology should be active rounding frequently and often, not when there's a problem, all the time, because clinicians won't necessarily call you when they have a problem. They're just going to go to their workarounds. So you need to be out there rounding with them. So you ask them real time, and then they will share. They're not shy. They will share with you what's working and what's not working.
Definitely. I remember one of the hospitals that I worked with, they made a new campus and didn't really get the nurses' input in where some of the air hoses were. And so then when the helicopter would land on the top of the hospital, all of those fumes would go into the patient's rooms because it wasn't designed. It was designed with the business in mind, not the clinical in mind. So I think that thing of having everybody at the table, with that saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And so I think having everybody at the table makes a huge difference. One last question. If there's any other questions, then please put them in the chat box. But one last question. How do you address healthcare workers who are resistant to technology changes in the industry? I know as a nurse, we're very resistant, or we like to do sometimes, unless you have a good leadership system who is very forward thinking, sometimes it's a lot easier to stay stuck in the way that it's always been. So how do you address those needs?
I find clinicians, if they understand the why am I doing this and what benefit is it to me, the patient, or the care team I work with, they engage much more effectively. I actually feel like maybe I'm biased because I'm a nurse. I don't think nurses are resistant to software. They're not resistant to change. They're resistant to being told to do something that doesn't make clinical sense, and it doesn't make sense to how they practice. So if you work with them on helping them understand the why and why it's going to benefit the patient and safer care, they buy into it. Med administration is a prime example of barcode meds. It's highly adopted. Mobile barcode meds on a device is much more accepted than on a cart. And that's because if you understand that the mobility of nurses and moving carts around, sometimes that handheld barcode med administration is much more effective for them if I'm doing a one-time med. But if I'm doing rounds with my whole patient list, then the cart's more appropriate. So if you work with them on what works best for them and how it works for them in different use cases, it gets a much broader engagement. When I started back in IT a long time ago, we thought hardwiring PCs to the bedside was ideal because then nurses could come in and do that. What happened is nurses were turning their backs to the patients to work on the computer, and nurses don't want to turn their backs to the patient. So that's why they went on carts, is where they could navigate the cart where they wanted to go. And then they didn't want to take a cart in the middle of the night and wake up a patient. And that's where the mobile devices started to come into play. So as we learn more about the dynamics of clinicians and what works and what doesn't work, we evolve the technology and find different ways to do it. But it takes walking around and talking to them.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic presentation in talking with all of your expertise with that personal side and the clinical side and the technology side. So we super appreciate you coming and spending your evening with us. We appreciate all of our audience and participants who have asked questions and who have stayed to listen to the presentation. We appreciate you attending as well. As a reminder, if our October presentation will be on October 27th, which is a Compliance Alliance, leveraging interdisciplinary partnerships with Dr. Donovan Williams. And so we invite you to return with us again for next month's presentation. And let me just check this at all. No worries about the PowerPoint. You did a great job with sharing the information regardless. So thank you so much for this. And we will see you again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Carr.